Hello, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, so on and so forth. This is the feedback loop. We're going to be talking about developers' respect for players, focusing on things like difficulty, time investment, odd choices that developers make without really considering the player at the end of it all. And this is one of the most frustrating things about game development. I got to be honest, it really bugs me. All of this started it was the last feedback loop, I believe. User 109 on YouTube made a comment about the Easy Allies group. They've got a show called Frame Trap. They were talking, it's just a podcast sort of thing. They were talking about Wolfenstein. And Wolfenstein goes back ages and ages and ages, talking about the idea of the main character having different difficulty settings, but each has an image to go along with it. Right? You've got your regular and brutal and whatever the case there might be. But the lowest difficulty setting was the baby bonnet, right? So you got the character and you've got the little babies. It's so cute, right? The premise behind the Frame Trap thing that they were talking about, their little podcast, was that this is disrespectful to the player. It's actually bullying the player, even going as far as to say, bullying, which of course, the trigger word for an awful lot of people. Turns their ears off. But I kind of agree with it, actually. I find the idea of insulting your player to be weird, very questionable. Why would you ever insult your player? Now, Wolfenstein, that as a pedigree, actually goes back quite a ways. The original Wolfenstein 3D, if I recall correctly, had the little baby bonnet with the soother as the easiest difficulty. Could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that was the case. This is not new stuff, right? The idea of showing off the easy mode and making fun of the player who chooses the easy mode. But again, it's worth asking the question, if you're making this game for people to enjoy it, why would you even include an easy mode if you're going to use that as an opportunity to insult somebody? It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But on the topic of difficulty, we had a user on Discord called Keo talking about Resident Evil 4. Saying that the game doesn't let you skip ahead, doesn't ask you to pay or grind. It only asks that you meet a skill not higher than what it thinks you're at, and it adjusts to you. It seems to try to keep artificial difficulty at a minimum. And that's actually a very interesting concept. It's not the only time when a game has done that. There have been other games that have. It's called dynamic difficulty scaling. It's I wouldn't say fairly common thing. Usually people are allowed to choose whether they want the easy, medium, hard, brutal, right? You get to pick that. But games have used this kind of artificial scaling for a reasonable amount of time, right? They increase the levels of enemies that you're going to fight, the difficulty level or the damage output, the types of enemies that you might go up against. You look at a game like Fallout 3 or New Vegas, they had some of that difficulty scaling in them. Another game like Mario Kart, right? A lot of people don't think that, well, Mario Kart doesn't have any difficulty scaling. Are you sure? When was the last time you were in first place and you got a blue shell? Right? The further back in the line you are, the better the items you get to get you moving forward. The game is designed around trying to prevent people that are behind, people that are doing worse, from being completely blown out of the water by the other people that they're playing with. This is something often referred to as rubber banding. Heroes of the Storm does this as well. You have that gap in experience, gap in levels between two teams, and the lower team will get a higher amount of experience, or the reverse. I'm not really sure. I can't recall which one it was, but you end up with this artificial system to try and keep the different players at the different skill levels kind of closer together. But what bothers me a little bit about automatic difficulty scaling is that it is a little bit of it's a bit of a respect issue for the player. Now you can argue both sides. You can say that, the player should always be able to choose whatever difficulty they want. And that's true to a point. Sometimes the game knows better. Sometimes the game knows that you've died too often. Sometimes the game will remind you that you've died too often, and maybe that's the point where the game becomes disrespectful. Super Mario Brothers, New Super Mario Brothers on the Wii, offers to finish the level for you if you've died too many times. And I don't recall if it was the Luigi version of the game that on the Wii U that offers, I believe that it was kind of a cheat mode sort of thing where it shows you how to finish the level. It gives you a little bit of help, a little bit of assistance. That is insulting. The constant reminder that you have failed so many times, you have died so many times, that we are going to, right, just blatantly in your face, remind you, by the way, you're terrible. How would you like us to finish this level for you? Absolutely painful. It is just, it's one of those things that makes me want to stop playing a game, because I like that a level in Mario is hard. I like the idea of a very difficult level. And I know that I'm going to die 15, 20 times, something along those lines before I actually finish that level. I don't want to be reminded after the first 5 deaths that I'm terrible and the game wants to finish it for me. No. I know that it's going to take me time. That's fine. That's respecting the player, allowing the player to make those decisions. If they're having a hard time, they can put the game down. If you want to put a difficulty option in your game, you put it in there. Everybody knows that there's, oh, it's frustrating. Everybody knows that you can either show your difficulty up at the beginning of the game, let people choose, or give them an option in the options menu where they can select it and change it on the fly. This is basic stuff. This has been around for years and years and years and years. It's just how it goes. But to bring it into the game itself and have the game remind you that you're terrible, well, you know, that's an awful lot like that Wolfenstein example, isn't it? The baby bonnet. It's the bullying of the player. I don't know that it's bullying, but it sure is insulting. You're reminding the player yet again that they're terrible. Maybe you should be playing on a lower difficulty. Some games will actually tell you. Why would you do that to your players? Why would you ever subject your player to some kind of negative reinforcement saying you are no good at this game? That doesn't make any sense. Now, there is an argument to be made for games that are competitive in nature. So something along the lines of Dota 2, right? Dota 2, you can't really handhold players for very long because the instant they're out of the tutorial, they're now impacting other people, right? This is a totally valid point of contention. It was something that that Hypergrip on Discord had mentioned as well. Players who have a negative new player experience will leave your game. It's as simple as that. And so he was talking about the idea of a forced tutorial as being a frustrating element of difficulty / player respect. And I tend to agree. I find the idea of a forced tutorial a difficult thing. But at the same time, when you're looking at something like Dota 2, and I think this was partly his point, was the idea that sometimes that forced tutorial is essential. Sometimes you need that forced tutorial in order to ensure that players are not ruining the experience of other people. But that's a multiplayer game. That's a competitive game. That's not a single player experience sitting there by yourself on your couch doing a whole lot of nothing. Unacceptable, in my opinion, to insult your players. I had another comment that actually really I quite like, and I wish more games would do this. And it kind of bleeds into a discussion on Dark Souls and difficulty and all of that. Jeremy Comans on YouTube, and this is it's a little bit of a longer one, but bear with me here. Recently, I came across a section on the 2001 game Anachronox. It was part time respecting, part gameplay concession. It was a one-off speedboat-based dodge the barrels on rails section in an otherwise wordy RPG with an active time battle combat system. If you failed it, you could try it again, or it had a, quote, "can we just pretend I beat that" option. I wish more games had that, and I agree with Jeremy on this point. I find that Dark Souls is an interesting one because it is always brought up as this shining example of the perfect game, the perfect way of doing a player introduction, the perfect way of doing a lot of these sorts of things. And I don't know that I agree all the time. I'm in the camp of people that I genuinely think that Dark Souls should have an easy mode. I don't see there being anything wrong with that. And I generally disagree with the people who do think that it should not have an easy mode, because I don't understand why someone else's experience needs to impact you directly. Right? There's nothing saying that by putting in an easy mode into a game, or by putting in options where I have failed at something in a game, that I can choose to skip it. But I have to be very careful when I argue that point, because I was just talking about the idea of Super Mario coming up and reminding you that I'm going to help you finish this level if you die too often. Right? How insulting that needs to be, which is just, I don't know, one of those things. So let's move on to another bit here. I want to talk a bit about the time aspect of respect. Go Liver on Discord, or Go Liver, I'm going to go with Go Liver, talking about developers respecting players' time. Said, I don't really like what Saints Row did, at least 3 and 4. 3/4 of the story missions are introducing some mini game or activity. And I tend to agree. I tend to agree with that. I would actually go a step further, and I would say Grand Theft Auto 5. Why did I need a side quest to go and learn how to ride a bicycle in the mountains? Why did I need a main quest that required me to drive all the way across the map and then back? Why did I need so many of these different kinds of activities in order to progress the main story? Well, it's because it's not respecting of time. That's what an open world game is all about. An open world game is designed very specifically to waste your time. It gives you small snippets of fun content spread apart by large areas. All of these different areas are, you know, you've got your, fine, go back to Grand Theft Auto 5, you've got cars you can travel, you've got planes and all these things. And that's the stuff people love doing, all of that kind of nonsense. But going back and forth and doing collectibles and this and that, this is not high skill gameplay, right? The skill that went into Grand Theft Auto was in a very short campaign and a very beautiful looking world. And that's about it. The game's not magic. But it certainly doesn't respect players' time, not in the slightest, which is a bit on the disappointing side, right? As just about every major open world game that's out there right now. Another interesting example that came up in some of the comments from Distron on YouTube, he was talking about Soma, and I played through Soma, and I had a good time with it. But one of the things that he brought up was the idea of these different monsters that you have to deal with, right? The monsters can kill you. There's really nothing you can do to them. You have to avoid them. That's basically the point. You know, a little bit looser than that, but that's the point. And so he was talking about how he hated having to wait for the monsters to decide that it was time to wander off so that he could go and do his own thing, right? And progress throughout the game. You know, he says, I just wanted to pick up a pipe or something and just bash them. Found myself pulling up my phone to play Fallout Shelter in these long sections of waiting, and finally installed a mod specifically to make it so the monsters couldn't attack you, so you could just go through and finish the game. And I found that to be a really good example. It's a very interesting one because people don't tend to consider that when they're thinking about something wasting their time. And part of the reason why I wanted to talk about all of these, really, it comes down to that when you're making a video game, your whole focus should be on the player. Everything that you do is all about dealing with what is best for the player. Thinking about what is the most fun, what is the most interesting, what is the best decision for the player. And so the developers making Soma obviously didn't consider how long players would have to be sitting there waiting in order to get past one of these different monsters. Right? It was a little bit disappointing. Thinking back to it, I actually agree, and I didn't notice it at the time, but it's very much a fair point. One of the questions that came up that I really liked, actually, and this was from L'acrylic on YouTube, asking whether it's possible to vary a game's length by restricting features, weakening enemies, or cutting certain parts of the story. And using Grand Theft Auto 5 as an example, right? The player could select a full, shortened, or I got shit to do version, and the game would be, say, a normal length, or 8 to 10 hours, or 4 hours long, depending on what you chose. This is actually something that I've not seen games try. Right? Open world games tend to go and try and rely on the idea that players know the difference between the main storyline and the optional quests. They tend to confuse the player by showing them all of these different quest markers, all these different activities to do, all of these different things to soak up your time, to waste your time, because that's what gets them the big 100 hours in this game, by wasting players' time. And wouldn't it be interesting to have a game that, instead of just letting the player choose whether or not they want to use the slow version of the game, that I got shit to do, I'm busy, I just want to play the story quest. Why not? Why not in a game like The Witcher? Maybe a bad example because I really like the side quests, but there were a ton of them. Why not allow people playing The Witcher to just shut off all of the optional quests and have the game adjust its difficulty appropriately, so that your main quest, you play through it from start to finish. You're not going to go do any of that side nonsense. You just want to hit the main story because you know what? That's most important. That's what you want to play and what you want to have fun doing. More games could actually take advantage of that. But it is very contrary to the idea of what an open world game is all about. An open world game, when a lot of this stuff started, and Skyrim would have been one of the bigger mass market ones. I know Oblivion and some of the earliers were quite large, but Skyrim was this just absolute monster in the game industry. And it was because of all the extra garbage, extra nonsense, right? It's this massive world that is about as deep as a swimming pool. Whereas you've got something like The Witcher that is a lot closer to an ocean, in my opinion, at the very least. So another comment that is worth chatting about, /16 on YouTube. The biggest design element that feels like a huge time waster is negative possibility space. This is when you give the game, or when the game rather gives you the opportunity to go somewhere, or encourages you to go somewhere, and you find a dead end. Even worse is knowing that you will most likely find a dead end. There are some quests in Mass Effect Andromeda that have you search a number of spots for a clue, but only one of the spots will yield that clue. Still, the game will give you quest markers to all of them, which means chances are you're going to run into the wrong one first. Open world games do this kind of nonsense all the time. We're going to give you some fancy marker, some fancy quest. There's going to be something great and amazing over here. And then it turns out to just be meh, utter garbage. It's a little pickup item. It's just a piece of junk. Or nothing at all. We're going to show you this town. You can explore this whole town, but there's nothing in it. There's nothing there to see. Well, talk about wasting the player's time. Talk about not respecting the player, really, at the end of the day. To kind of bridge this gap between the idea of difficulty into time and then a little bit more generic on just respect itself. I wanted to do one other comment here from a fellow named Svardscamp on Discord, saying that Far Cry is an egregious example of a long-winded road to incremental upgrades for inventory space, the towers, the unlocks of camps, etc., etc. And he says, compare this to the open world of The Witcher 3 that is genuinely fun to discover and tread. No BS towers to provide nearby info or anything along those lines. Right? It is the ultimate example. Ubisoft is the ultimate example of the open world waste of time. Right? All of these different just garbage tasks. And for some reason, because there's a ton of junk, people enjoy it. So be it. And they're right to enjoy it. They can enjoy it all they want. But I see no reason whatsoever why it needs to be in every game. And it's disappointing as it starts to kind of bleed into other titles. But Far Cry actually had a really good example of respect for the player. And this is where I come back to the general idea that of what a game is. I've done a video on this quite a while ago talking about what I believe the definition of a game is. And when people talk about what is a game and what isn't a game, you know, they bring up Dear Esther and the Stanley Parable and all of these different sorts of things, right? The Edith Finch was a great title. I had a blast. It's not a game though, right? A game has to have a failure state, implied or explicit, doesn't matter. Either of those sorts of things. It has to have something in it that is a failure state. And the reason why is because the player has to matter. If you watch a movie, the viewer doesn't matter. If you play a game, the player matters. Now, the reason why the definition of a game matters, why it actually has value, is precisely because everything that you do as a game developer is based around player agency. Right? Everything that you do that takes control and influence away from the player is something that moves you in the direction of a non-interactive entertainment product. So the more a thing is a game, the more involved the player is in the experience of that product. That's why I believe the definition of a game matters. It's not so that you can take two products, put them side by side and say, oh, that one's a game. Not worth your time. No, not at all. Because something like the Stanley Parable, right, or Edith Finch, any of these different titles, they could be improved by continuing to iterate in that same design, by continuing to put in features that allow the player to be the focal point of the game, not necessarily the story be the focal point of the game. That's the important distinction. The player has to matter. More than anything else, the player has to matter. So why I mentioned that Far Cry actually had a very interesting thing, given that it's this terrible open world thing that doesn't care whether or not the player's doing anything. The intro sequence in Far Cry 4, if you wait 10 minutes, 15 minutes, I can't remember exactly how long it was, you have this meal, right? You're eating food, and you wait during this meal sequence. And at the end of it, if you just sit there and wait, you don't actually do what the game is telling you you need to do, you get to go and you get to spread your mother's ashes and the game ends 20 minutes into the game. It gives you an ending for doing something that the developers anticipated the player might try. And that's actually a very, very respectful, I would say respectful thing for a developer to do. It's a very interesting way of trying to predict what a player might do and make sure that there was something that would happen because the player went down that road. The Stanley Parable is actually a good example of something like this, even though I don't really put it on the same, I don't really call it a game. It's an experience that people should have. It is excellent, absolutely fantastic, not really a game. But it is great at predicting what the player is going to do. It gives you these different options, and there's always that line from the narrator to bring you back to earth and say, yeah, you thought you were so clever. We already thought of that. I really liked that. I thought that was very, very neat. It's a great way of showing the player that they matter. And that's really what all of this comes down to. If you're going to waste your player's time, if you're going to insult your player through the difficulty options by having your game remind them that they should be playing on easy or giving them a baby bonnet for choosing easy in the first place, you're not respecting your player. Right? In order to respect your player, you need to consider them first and foremost in everything that you are doing with the design of your video game. Absolutely first and foremost. There's a couple of other games that are actually, or game producers, I should say, that are interesting, I would say competing ideals in some of these ways. You look at somebody like David Cage. I don't particularly like his games, but the idea that you can have a different non-ideal ending because you screwed something up in the game, that's cool. That's really neat. It's not a game over screen. It allows you to move on. And you take that and you contrast that with the old Sierra games, King's Quest 4 or 5, I can't remember. There was, and it's probably more than that, but one of the King's Quests, I recall, you can screw it up and it doesn't tell you that you screwed it up. There's a quest item that you cannot pick up in that game. You can progress to the point where you can no longer go back to that area. And when you get further into the game, which is hours and hours down the road, you'll find, shit, I can't finish this game. What terrible, terrible design is that? And it wasn't even a bug. It was just like, that's how they built the game. It's terrible. They didn't consider the player as the focal point, the first and foremost thing in their game. They thought, whatever, they'll miss it. They'll have to start over. Okay, I think we're past that. Another really good game that has this same sort of problem is Domina. I recently did the second impressions of it. I've streamed it a couple of times. It's phenomenal to me. And this is where I want to give developers maybe a little bit of extra breathing room, a little bit of extra credit. The developer of Domina had genuinely no idea why players wanted a save game. Because to him, he's playing it all the time. He's able to move through it pretty quick. He's upgrading his stuff and he's doing really well, and it's easy and it's no problem, and he can finish it in a few hours. Why would anybody want a save game function? Well, I'm going to play it for a half an hour, and then I'm going to shut it down, and I'm going to go do something else like search for my missing cat, and then I'm going to come back and play it for another 15 minutes or another half an hour. I need a save game function. I'm not going to play the game if it doesn't have one. It's important to me. It wasn't important to him as the developer. So his vision got in the way of him selling games. There were so many people that I had talked to that, they loved the way that game looked. This gladiator simulator, all kinds of fun. It just looks great. No save game? Well, I'm not going to buy it then. Why would I do that? I have to play the game for 6 hours or 4 hours at a time? No. Who has the time to do that? And it wasn't the only example. There are a number of features in Domina that are like that, right? That just, why would you develop the game this way? Developers kind of get this tunnel vision into this, this is what the product I'm going to make, and this is amazing, and it's wonderful, and everything's perfect. Well, are you sure about that? Are you sure that players should have to individually upgrade the left and the right pauldron on your gladiator? Why? The left and the right shin guard? Why? Why not both at the same time? Doesn't make sense, right? It's not paying attention to what makes an experience the best for the player. That's really what it all comes down to. Focusing and making 100% sure that your game is based around the player. Respecting their time, respecting their intelligence, respecting that maybe they don't want to play on the hardest, most brutal elite difficulty. Hardcore bullshit nonsense. Now, there's one more comment that I want to talk about. And this is the biggest one because it's the one that frustrates me the most, the one that actually makes me angry. And I realized I kind of got a little riled up towards the end of that last bit, but demotivated on Discord when talking about things respecting the player or not respecting the player, as the case may be. Paid unlocks. He says, all the incentives for free-to-play games are designed to frustrate the player just enough to drop money for relief. Any game with microtransactions has a built-in incentive to make the game take just slightly longer than the player thinks that it should to increase their sales conversion rates. And he's absolutely correct. And this is one of the most frustrating things in the video game industry that I have ever run into. That's really what it comes down to. Right? The idea of me putting something into my game that stops you from playing. So this is your timer-based sorts of things, right? Or that requires you to pay money to not unlock content, but to just make yourself a little bit better and make yourself able to skip the game. This is not respect for the player. This is not something that is considering your player first as an important part of the experience. No, this is considering your game as nothing more than a monetization platform. It's always been disappointing. It's never not going to be disappointing. And yet, it all gets worse. Right? Every game that comes out, we start to deal with these the moment that we had full $60 video games that had fucking microtransactions in them, It hurts. It sickens me. The greed, the level of greed that is out there, the level of disrespect for the player, the amount of not giving a shit about your audience is just painful. It's disgusting. It's embarrassing. Right? You have a development house filled with artists, filled with people who are at the peak of their craft, the best coders, the best 3D graphic designers, the best animators, the best sound designers. Take your pick. The list goes on and on. These people want to make a great game. Well, where does the disrespect come from? Is it them? Well, sometimes when they get that tunnel vision, a lot of it comes from the publisher. We've known this for a long time. Just kind of how it goes. So I think I want to close this up by, again, just sort of reiterating why I think things like the definition of a game and why respect matters. A game that values your time, a game that allows you to choose your difficulty, allows you to feel like a badass at all times. Doom, actually, was a great example of that. You could pick whatever difficulty you wanted. You can adjust it how you see fit. You still feel like a badass at any point because there's all kinds of awesome nonsense going on. Respecting your players makes them happy. When your players are happy, they buy more of your game and they talk to their friends about your game and they do all of these wonderful things. If you don't, well, you end up with problems. You end up with Hitman, a game that really was not designed for the player, a game that was designed as a way of lowering the risk for Square Enix, giving them lower financial exposure so they could put this game out over a longer period of time, maybe have some DLC after it was all over, and seasons and nonsense, hogwash. And now IO Interactive is facing layoffs as a result of that decision. Hey, do whatever you want. If you don't want to be supporting your players, if you don't want to be thinking that your player is the #1 thing in that business transaction, that you need to keep them happy so they come back for the next game, enjoy your bankruptcy. This has been Feedback Loop. Thank you very much for tuning in. My name is Tarmack. Please drop your comments down below for what you think the next topic could be. I think that would be excellent. I would love to hear your thoughts. This is an awful lot of fun. I'm going to need to go find another game to play here for the next few minutes. We'll have to wait and see how that goes. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time as I go ban a troll in the chat.